Ever since the SNC-Lavalin story broke, the political polls have shifted. The Liberals dipped and the Conservatives took the lead. But something may be amiss for the Tories in Ontario, specifically the 905 area. And that something may be Doug Ford. CBC Polls analyst Eric Grenier is here to discuss just that. Hey, Eric.
Hi, Bash.
Let's talk about Ontario right now. How do they look for the Conservatives? Why is it so important?
Yeah, we haven't seen much movement in the polls nationwide. You're still looking at about a 6-point lead for the Conservatives. But in Ontario, we're not seeing the kind of lead you'd expect for a party that's leading nationwide. If we look at where the numbers are right now in the poll tracker in Ontario only, we have the Conservatives at about 37%, the Liberals are at 34%, the NDP is at 18%, and the Greens are at 8%. We really just haven't seen much movement in the SNC-Lavalin affair. It dropped the Liberal support, but it didn't really pick up for the Conservatives. In the beginning of the year, in some of our averages at the beginning in January, early February, the Conservatives are actually above 37%. So in Ontario, we've seen that they've actually either held their support or dropped. They haven't seen any benefit from the controversy that has certainly sapped Liberal support.
And what does that compare to in the rest of the country?
That's why it's really fascinating, because in other parts, you're seeing big gains for the Conservatives, up maybe 5 points in Quebec, in the Prairies, up maybe as high as 9 points in Atlantic Canada, holding in BC, holding in Alberta. When you're seeing that they've jumped maybe 3-4 points nationwide, but have actually dropped a little bit or held their own in Ontario, there's certainly a difference between the two areas. So when you're seeing that in Atlantic Canada, for example, the lead that the Liberals had is now down by 22 points. In Quebec, they had a lead that is now 11 points smaller than it was when this affair broke. But in Ontario, only a shift of a couple points. It shows that something different is happening in Ontario, and it's hurting the Conservatives' ability to get to a point where they'd be in a majority territory.
Is that something different, Doug Ford? And I ask because we've talked about previously, especially in the past 2-3 weeks, we have seen a big shift in the polls there as a result of the decisions that came from the last budget, the provincial budget.
Yeah, we saw some polls just over out in the last couple of weeks. There was one by Ipsos Global News that had approval rating for Ford and the PC government at 30%, disapproval at 70%. Nearly half of Ontarians said they strongly disapprove of Ford and the PC government. Those are the kinds of numbers that Kathleen Wynne had when she was in power, just before she was defeated. And there's some other polls by Main Street and Abacus showed the favorability rating, or people who have a positive impression of the Ontario Premier, somewhere around 20-22%. So that is very low numbers for a new government. We've seen in the past in Ontario, governments sometimes have a bit of a dip. They don't really have a honeymoon that often in Ontario. It's more of the opposite of a honeymoon. But we're seeing that could be one of the factors that's limiting the Conservatives' appeal, because everywhere else, the Conservatives seem to be doing pretty well. In Ontario, where the PCs are struggling, Andrew Scheer is also apparently struggling a bit.
And we saw a bit of a reaction to that last week from the federal Conservatives, who amended their pledge, basically, where the deficit is concerned, right? Mm-hmm. Because a lot of the concern around what the Ford government is doing is what happens as a result of wanting to contain the size of the deficit. And the Conservatives had promised, the federal Conservatives, Andrew Scheer, in his leadership campaign, to balance the books in 2 years. Now he's going to do it in 5. They're saying it's because the Liberals have messed up the books so bad. But behind the scenes, there is certainly concern that they would face the same kind of critique that the Ford government is now.
Yeah, trying to avoid some of the arguments that the Liberals are setting up that Andrew Scheer will be like Doug Ford. We saw them also separating themselves a little bit from the cuts were made to Franco-Ontarian services, that the federal Conservatives were very sensitive about being tied to that. So clearly they are aware that this could be a problem, and the numbers we're seeing right now suggest that it might be a problem right now.
It'll be interesting to see if Ford's reversal on many of those cuts, not all of them, but many of them, have an effect on that.
We'll see.
All right, thank you, Eric. CBC's polls analyst, Eric Grenier. Welcome back to Power and Politics in the Power Panel with Amanda Alvaro, Andrew Thompson, Tim Powers, and Chris Hall. Earlier on the show, just a few moments ago, I spoke with CBC polls analyst Eric Grenier. He has been crunching the numbers on the increase in support for the Conservatives since the beginning of this year, support that doesn't seem to be increasing at the same rate in Ontario as it has been in other regions of the country. So, Andrew, I'm going to start off with you. Obviously, we had discussed the possible link with Doug Ford. We know, for example, that the Conservatives sort of amended their campaign pledge when it comes to how fast they'll balance the books. Last week, they didn't say it was because of Doug Ford. They said it was because of Liberal mismanagement. But certainly we know the polls for Doug Ford have dipped quite a bit since his budget was introduced. Do you think there's a connection?
I suspect there's a bit of a connection. It's also a very tough argument that the Conservatives need to put forward here in Ontario to convince voters that last election they were wrong. And that's really what they need to be able to do in this case, is to convince voters who have, in this province, returned a lot of Liberals to Ottawa over the years, that they want to go back to that Stephen Harper type government. And I'm not sure that they do. Doug Ford here kind of serves as a reminder of what that type of government can be like. And so I think, if anything, it's really muddied the debate. I don't think there's a direct linkage that the concern about how Doug Ford is handling the provincial matters is directly affecting Andrew Scheer, but I do think it is piling on a little bit about just general concern about what they're going to get instead if they vote the Trudeau government out.
I'm pretty sure that Andrew Scheer's people don't lie awake at night worrying too much about Doug Ford, but they are worried about how Doug Ford might be used against them. In other words, because he's cutting, because he's had to backtrack on some of those cuts when it became clear, especially for municipalities, they were going to be retroactive and it would hit things like childcare and ambulance services. That's a good thing for the Liberals to weaponize in the federal campaign, saying, look, we've already seen how it works in Ontario. This is what's going to happen federally. So to that extent, I think the Andrew Scheer people are worried and watching, but I don't think that's the big, I don't know, Eric's got a better sense of the polls. I'm not sure that's the primary motivating factor.
Amanda, what do you think?
Well, I think that there's a few things at play. One of them is obviously the numbers, but I think even more important is message. So if you're the federal Conservatives and you watch, Ford's government come to power on the heels of really simple messaging, putting people first and talking about things like buck-a-beer and that type of retail politics, and in some cases populism that we've seen across the coast, you may have wondered if that's the type of campaign that they're gearing up to deliver. Well, now they have a problem, because in Ontario, you have Ontarians who are suffering from a feeling of regret, now watching this economic plan really turn into a cuts plan. They see big cuts to education and healthcare and child services, breakfast programs and libraries, and the services that people really rely on. And suddenly things like buck-a-beer aren't as shiny anymore. So I think it does become a challenge, not just for the Conservative movement, but for the Conservative message. So what do they do with that? They'll have to come to the table with, real policies. They'll have to debate against real ideas and values. And without having done that to this date, this is a big hill for them to climb with just a few months left to go.
Well, they are. I mean, they have been unveiling a few. They've done 3 policy speeches so far, and I wonder also what you think of the fact that we have seen the reversal on at least the municipal cuts that were being made, and whether that will mitigate it.
But I think Amanda hits on a key point. I think there's a difference between the personality and the temperament. The person, I think there's some remorse in some places in Ontario based around the Premier's style and the way of going about business and some of the things that Amanda says that he rightly has focused on at the moment, for good or bad. And I think people are uncomfortable with that. At least the polls show that. But I think what Premier Ford did well, and this is the trick for Andrew Scheer, is tap into the sentiment that's out there, not just in Ontario, but in other places, of a level of discontentment. Scheer has to figure out, does that level of discontentment still exist? And if it does, how does he tap into it in his way? I think what's really interesting is that Premier Kenney from Alberta is going to campaign in Ontario. And what does that tell me? That one, obviously there's a little bit of a tighter link, although Scheer and Kenney aren't the best of friends, or never traditionally were. But Jason Kenney, as everybody here knows, was very well plugged into different communities and some similar communities to Doug Ford. And I think if the Conservatives federally can use some of that, yes, and I think final point I'd say is Chris is right. The Liberals have long wanted to make the federal campaign not necessarily about going after Andrew Scheer, because that would inflate him, but about Doug Ford, Donald Trump, and potentially Jason Kenney. So Scheer's got to find his way through all of that himself.
So Chris, how do you navigate? Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yep.
I was just going to say, I don't think people should be going back to this idea that somehow Ontarians have all of a sudden decided they want Kathleen Wynne back. They don't.
No,
that's a very
They just
good point.
don't.
Well, it's specific to the budget, right? Like the numbers changed after the budget, and
but
then
I think
the
it's style.
It was a
that
disastrous rollout, and it was a case where even Conservatives are finding it hard to defend. They've allowed everyone who's getting cut to control their message. Strategically, it wasn't well done, and that's, I think, if there is regret, it's really about the way that that's being handled, and people questioning what are the cuts for and what direction are we headed.
And I also think, though, that it does, even if Scheer isn't, I don't know, even if he isn't entirely concerned about Ford and what that might mean for the federal election, it also, on the flip side, leaves a little bit of a window open for the Liberals, right? Because you can take Ontario as a case study in what happens when you vote for these types of issues. And you can use Ford and the playbook over the last year, the cuts that have ensued and what that's meant for families, and you could extrapolate what that could look like federally. So it provides a window that Scheer doesn't need to or want to fight.
I always come back to the idea that really the challenge for the Liberals in the next election campaign is to convince voters that they're better off than they were 4 years ago. And it's not obviously obvious to some people. But in Ontario, I'd also point out this isn't an intangible. But historically, Ontarians have tended to vote provincially in a different way than they do federally. So are they going to now suddenly say, well, we're going to vote Conservative federally because we have a Conservative government in Toronto? That hasn't been the tendency. Now, I can't give you a scientific explanation for that. I can just tell you that's been the trend for most years.
Okay,
but it is,
really quick.
It's just, but Andrew Scheer, that said, does need Doug Ford's ground forces.
Yes, he does.
And all of those people align with him if he hopes to win. So again, another balancing act.
Especially in the
Especially in the 905.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.